attention because we've got a great luncheon keynote speaker. And if you haven't had the benefit of hearing Fred Burton speak before, you're going to really come away with a great experience. You're going to hear from one of the foremost authorities in the world on terrorism. Fred is now working for Stratford. Stratford is abbreviated for Strategic Forecasting out of Austin. They're one of the key intelligence firms that are looked to by boardroom CEOs from around the world. They have probably 40 of the top 50 Fortune 500 companies. The CEOs have them on speed dial, and if they have an issue, they call Fred Burton. So that's his level of competence and how important people in the world perceive Fred on security-related issues and anything about their business assets or personal safety. Before Fred was at Stratford, he was in charge of diplomatic security at the Department of State. Most people didn't even know they had a diplomatic security branch until we had the death of one of our ambassadors recently. And Fred has written a book about that. It's called Under Fire. And one of the things you need to know is it's such a well-regarded book that HBO has bought the rights to that, and they're making a movie about it. So before Fred gets up here, I'm going to go ahead and ask him the first question. I want him to tell you the story about how they HBO bought the rights to that so that they can make a movie about it. One of the other things that's not on his bio, and I'm not going to read you his bio because you've got it in the packet, you know about it, but Fred wrote another book. It's about chasing shadows and also Ghost. One of the ways that Fred got his career started, he was a street cop is what I'll call it, in the outskirts of Washington, D.C., and one of the Israeli spies named Alon was assassinated. And Fred investigated that, brought it to resolution. He did such a fine job, the federal government went out and recruited him to come in and do more investigations, and he rose up to become, you know, the leader of diplomatic security to protect our diplomats around the world. That's another book that he's written that's in here. If you're really good and you're really nice to Fred, you go buy his book, you send it to him, he'll autograph it and send it back to you. So I've got all of his books that he signed, and they're an outstanding read. I fly a lot back and forth to Washington, D.C., and they're intriguing and they're exceptionally well-written books. I tell stories about Fred. One of the other things that he did, that most people don't know about, is he led the investigation. You heard about the World Trade Center bombing. The mastermind of that was Ramzi Youssef. Guess who did that investigation, determined who it was? Guess who the government sent over to arrest him? Fred Burton. If you encounter Fred in a dark alley, don't challenge him. He may be a small frame fella, but he's a tough guy. So without further ado, I want you to give a warm Center for Terrorism Law for Fred Burton. He's going to enlighten you with his knowledge about the intelligence community, and then be sure and ask him a couple of questions. We're going to save some time at the end. So Fred, thank you for your time, and thank you for coming, sir.
I think Peter needs to be my marketing officer. I recorded everything he said about me, Peter. Well, I really appreciate the opportunity to come and speak. I'm at a stage in my career that I kind of pick and choose what I want to do anymore. I'm fortunate enough to be able to do that, and I know what St. Mary's Center does is outstanding work, and Peter's a very good friend. So when he asked, I certainly wanted to come and visit and share a few words on how we look at cyber. And I know that there's probably a fair number of, can I use this word, geeks in the crowd? I don't say that to be offensive. but this might stretch your thought process a little bit as to how at least our company views cyber, which is a little bit contrarian. And from an alternative analysis perspective, we always strive to be thought-provoking and maybe give you a few things that perhaps you haven't thought of, though I'm sure just based on the contacts in this room and some of the experiences that many of you have, you already know a tremendous amount on this topic. But I think, and driving down here this morning from Austin, I thought a little bit about what I should say. And I think the mindset aspect is critical. And for that, I see a fair amount of gray hair or no hair, and I can say that too since I'm in that category myself. I think it's important from a mindset perspective to take a little bit as to how I was shaped. And I think that's important. I've sat through a lot of these events at times and not really understood the mindset of the speaker. So let me give you a little bit about mine and kind of what shaped my outlook. And also shapes my writings at our company as well as my books. I'm the son of a West Virginia coal miner. Thank you. My dad went off to World War II and fought with the Big Red One. And then after the war, he became a military policeman in Nuremberg. And I don't think I need to go into that, but everybody knows what happened in Nuremberg. And my dad didn't talk much about the war, except when he was drinking. And then he shared stories about the execution of the Nazis that not so sure I wanted to hear him, but I did. And then as Peter alluded to this, I'm a little bit like Forrest Gump, I think, and looking back at my life and career. I was probably in the wrong place at the wrong time, a fair amount of time. But in my neighborhood, an Israeli intelligence officer was assassinated, gunned down after returning home from a party. And I had gone to high school with his daughters. And as a 17-year-old kid at the time, you really don't think about geopolitics of the world. You just know that this death has occurred in your neighborhood, and you're really not sure what happened. The government of Israel flew the family back to Israel the next day, and I wouldn't see the daughters again for almost 35 years when they reached out to me to help me solve, asked me to help solve the murder of their dad. So I think I did, and that was my book, Chasing Shadows. And then when I was an agent with the government, with the State Department specifically, in 1988, the government dispatched me to Kuala Lumpur, Pakistan, to investigate the death of the last United States ambassador killed in the line of duty before Ambassador Stevens in Benghazi. And the media always gets this wrong, but Ambassador Arnie Rayford perished aboard PAC-1, which was the presidential aircraft that was carrying President Zia of Pakistan, U.S. Army Brigadier General, our United States ambassador, and the entire Pakistani cabinet, except for the chief of the Pakistani intelligence services that watched the plane go down from a Cessna. I wasn't the sharpest knife in the drawer, but I called that a clue. That was my first clue that something was amiss, that everybody perished on that plane except for the ISI chief. But I had been on the job 3 years, and I was all of 26 years old, I believe, when I was dispatched to Pakistan to figure out how that plane crashed. Having a fair amount of experience in that 3-year period of time investigating hijackings and bombings, but nothing of that magnitude. I would later learn that I was dispatched to pretty much buy time. And buy time used by the government in that capacity because it was the closest we came to nuclear war since the Cuban Missile Crisis, because of the saber rattling between Pakistan and India as to the cause of that plane crash. And if you want to know why that plane crashed, you'll have to read my book. I'm not going to spoil it for you, but it has all the plots and twists of a Le Carre novel. And then in, I believe it was 1995, I was involved with the capture of Ramzi Youssef, the mastermind of the first World Trade Center bombing. And quite frankly, we got lucky. We had an informant that we paid $1.2 million in cash. I'm not so sure we would have ever caught him if that hadn't been the case. And we simply, sometimes the gods smile upon you when we capture him. But my career was over at that point because I got in a fair amount of trouble for that because I didn't tell my bosses what I was doing because I figured that they would just simply screw things up. How many of us have been in similar situations? Yeah. I see another hand that should probably be raised too in the back there. But I won't say why. But anyways, that's my career. And that shapes a lot about what I decide to write about, what I talk about. But I think it all boils down to listen to my dad talk about good and evil as a small child and listening to his description of hanging the Nazis and liberation of concentration camps. I probably have already messed things up already here. Let me try to get to the next slide. A little technical error, but we'll work through it here, I'm sure. In looking at espionage from, cyber espionage from the standpoint of, Alec, I could use your help. We kind of take a holistic perspective of this, meaning we simply don't view cyber as a silo. And for some reason, thank you. See, I knew we had a lot of smart ideas. We view cyber as merely another tool of espionage. And we look at it holistically, meaning that if you did the FBI behavioral profile of Edward Snowden, I'm sure it would be identical to the profile of Philip Agee. Who remembers Philip Agee? Philip Agee defected, was formerly with the CIA and defected to the Cubans. Although he tried to go to the Soviets first, it didn't matter. The Soviets ultimately learned everything that Philip Agee had to say about CIA operations around the world, not to mention the identification of hundreds of members of the CIA clandestine services, which brings me back to one of my cases and ultimately got involved with, which was the assassination of the CIA station chief in Athens, Greece, as a result of him being specifically identified by Philip Agee. But the important takeaway from that for students of Cold War history, which I would like to think that many of us are in this room, I know I am, and I know many of you are, is that if you model Philip Agee's behavior, it almost is identical to that of an Edward Snowden. And I would encourage you all to take a deep dive into Philip Agee. We don't have a lot of time to look at it now, but it's a fascinating read into treachery. And treachery of the highest order that directly results in the death of a CIA station chief a few years later in Athens, Greece. But If you think of that in context, is that any different than what Kim Philby did, the infamous MI6 double agent that was working for the Soviets at the time, and the band known as the Cambridge Five, which he was one of. I think it's important to look at that as a model too when we think about cyber as an espionage tool, but then also think in concept of another case that I got dragged into, which was Jonathan J. Pollard, who was working for the Defense Department at the time and turned out to also be selling secrets, though he claims that he didn't, to the government of Israel. As many of you know in this room, there are no friendly intelligence services. I know some of you don't want to hear that, but there are no friendly intelligence services. I happen to have attended a few meetings with Jonathan J. Pollard, and afterwards when he was caught, of course the witch hunt begins and the FBI wants to know why I'm in meetings with Jonathan J. Pollard, and it's like attending a meeting like here and having no idea that Pollard was even in the room, but it didn't matter to the Bureau at the time. My point is that if you look at the history of treachery and people selling secrets, cyber, in our assessment, is just another tool, and it's just one tool. Now, the benefit I have at Stratfor is this. I have the opportunity to visit with something like 45 of the Fortune 50s. Chief security officers, chief intelligence officers. I don't know, I've lost track of the Fortune 500s that we do some sort of work for. Not to mention the alphabet soup government agencies and so forth. And what I'm always struck is that I'm usually visiting with a chief security officer or a board member, or I'm visiting with a chief IT officer. There's very few companies that have a combined model, which is something interesting. And I think from a emerging kind of profession, we're going to see more and more of that. For example, Dell comes to mind. Dell has merged the job between the chief security officer and the chief the chief technology officer into one. And to me, that's the kind of the future when you look. But I'm not so sure that there's the subject matter expertise in folks like from my field of being former agents have the bandwidth that some of you have in the IT space. And I don't know how you bridge that gap. But it's kind of interesting to me that there is that bridge in some companies, but then there is not that bridge in others, and there's very defined silos and occupations when you look at that. This is old school for many of you. When we look at Cyber 2, we look at it in the concept of the old acronym of MICE, which means that it's just another tool of espionage, and that if I want to get access to a company, there's a whole range of different variables I could use. I certainly could use money, ideology, maybe Snowden was a little bit of both, compromise, I don't know, time will tell. I think the real question with Snowden is how long had he been working for the Russians before he jumped ship? I'm sure there's some mixed assessment as to that, and we very well may not know. Ego as well. But when you look at this from a strategy perspective, how do you defend against it? That's the challenge. Human. Anybody know who this is?
Chapman.
Anna Chapman, who was one of the Russian sleeper agents up in New York that had been sent and dispatched to try to recruit assets within the government. And how do you deal with these kinds of variables? Meaning, as a chief IT officer at your company, are you focused on the human kind of capacities that take place inside of any organization? Do you really know who your executives are meeting with when they travel all around the globe, or they go to events in Brussels or Bangkok or Beijing or Moscow? Certainly, cash. If you look at all these folks throughout the history of time, it's amazing to me how little people do sell out their country or their company for in relative terms. It really isn't a lot of money. It would not be my asking price if I had an asking price. I'm too old to have an asking price today. But everybody has an asking price to some degree. Everybody does. Nobody likes to admit it. But you can go back to your mice analogy and pretty much look at that, and I'm pretty confident that if you applied that to a lot of people, you could find a vulnerability and weakness that could be exploited. Do I necessarily need to recruit an IT person to have access to your systems? Not really. Not really. I just need to recruit the right kind of people that has the ability to get access to your systems. So think about that in concept with how do you prevent that from occurring. The holy grail that I'm consistently being asked, that I know that there are some technology developments into it, are how do I want a widget that will identify that insider. I want to buy that widget, that off-the-shelf widget that will tell me that the guy or gal down the hall is the next Edward Snowden or Philip Agee. Where is it? That's what I want to buy. Because it's the only thing our chief legal counsel understands. No offense, Professor. You know how lawyers are. They want to be able to have a program that's going to be non-offensive, that's not going to discriminate, that's going to be politically correct, but it's going to be able to identify the Edward Snowden that's in my office. And when you buy that, we're going to put it on our system, and it's going to make our board feel better. We don't really care if we catch anybody, but it's going to make everybody feel better if we have that in place, because we can say for compliance purposes we have this insider threat program that's up and running, and yes, we're going to find Anna Chapman, Edward Snowden, and the next Philip Agee. So, if you've designed that system, drop me a note. I can point a lot of business your way, and we would probably buy it ourselves. But if I really just want to get information about your company, do I really have to think about it in a cyberspace at all? Why not just use the infamous intern ploy? Getting those interns or grad students, to walk the halls and collect all the information about your company that I possibly could need, and then, yes, can take that thumb drive into your system to download exactly what I need. How many of you have systems in place to identify the placement of a thumb drive on your system or device? Let me see a show of hands. At least one, maybe two, three? That's great. I go to the largest companies in the world, and at times the most classified companies in the world, and I can walk in with a thumb drive, and it's right out of like a bad episode of Homeland. If I was predisposed to either insert something onto a system, or if I had the technology skills to be able to download that. I don't know how you prevent against that, but obviously companies have. I know this, if I tried to install or institute some sort of program at our company, we do so many talks and speeches and have thumb drives and PowerPoints, I would have a cane mutiny on my hands inside of Stratfor if I tried to take everybody's thumb drive. Imagine that. If we shook everybody down at the door and took your thumb drives. we see this happening a lot. We see very robust cyber plans in place, but we don't see a lot of investigation or systems to cover other aspects besides cyber. Meaning, if you step back to what began this talk, was a holistic umbrella look that cyber is just part and parcel of one tool as part of that espionage campaign. The threat of economic espionage, we hear it every day. Next to, I need that software to put on my system because legal claims I need something. The second biggest question we get at our company from all of our Fortune 500s is this: I have employees in Israel. How do I protect my intellectual property, Fred? And I say, good luck. We wish you well. Or, my chief IT officer is in China. Do you think that's a problem, Fred? Well, maybe. Perhaps you should relocate him to North Korea. Maybe that will help. If Russia is not available. How do you protect an infrastructure with a global workforce, with global employees in places that you and I both know they're vulnerable? And does the board really want to hear about it? Or does your chief legal counsel really want the chief security officer in there talking about your staff in Vietnam? You know how much money we're saving, Fred, in Vietnam? This is our list, by the way. We have a very broken down matrix that puts threat rankings on this as well, if anybody's interested on that. Be happy to get it to you. We feel strongly about this from the standpoint of not looking at just the cyber, but looking at it from a holistic perspective. Back to my China example, or Russia. Don't lose sight of the power of the ability of that nation state, such as the MSS or the PLA in China, to visit your employee's mom, sister, brother, and say, look, we really need some help here on this topic. It's time for us to have tea, and let's discuss a few things. How do you know if your employees are being honest with you about those kinds of approaches? How do you know that the family members have told that affected employee that that's occurred to begin with? Are you hoping that the FBI or the CIA alerts you to that? Please don't hold your breath. They will if they find it, don't get me wrong. But the chances of them finding it ahead of time is pretty slim. This is a powerful tool that places like China utilize to gain access to your employees here in the United States. And it's kind of like the elephant in the room. Nobody wants to talk about it. Nobody really wants to deal with it. The other aspect is the ability to create huge perks for your employees at times, or gifts to family members, for example, if they do cooperate. But all they need is that thumb drive sent to their daughter and inserted on the company website. And I'll leave you with this and take a few questions. We think the better that we become in cyber, the defensive measures, the much more aggressive state sponsors, state intelligence agencies, or contract parties, or outsourced actors are going to be targeting specifically your people, trying to approach it from that aspect versus a brute force kind of approach into your system. And that brings me back to the Cambridge Five and Philip Agee and Kim Philby. That people at the bottom line is going to be your greatest vulnerability when it comes to this. For those of you who have Twitter, please follow me, because I have more Twitter followers than anybody at the company, and I want to torture everybody around the coffee pot. So please follow me. You may have to put up with some anti-FBI rants at times. Anybody from the Bureau here? Any questions? I think we have a few minutes. I don't know how we do this. Yes, sir.
Hey, Fred, thanks for your speech. I'm Dave Newman from Rackspace. This idea of espionage and cyber and not looking at things in isolation. If I give you an example, the New York Times recently published an op-ed or an article about 18 of 20 CIA agents in China that have either been in prison or murdered, right? They're linking this back to a lot of a possible mole inside the agency. But, you know, is there connective tissue between that and the OPM theft, you know, 65 million SF-86s and those kinds of things? What is your kind of thought process on approaching something not in isolation to really derive that connective tissue, help organizations understand risk, and then really attack that at the most appropriate places?
Well, I think it's a great question, and I think that was a wonderful piece of investigative journalism that the New York Times did in exposing that. And it's, quite frankly, pretty frightening when you think of the Chinese picking up reportedly or allegedly operating assets of the CIA in some capacity and then literally killing them. And I think, and we talked at length about that at Stratfor when that came to light, because I mean, that really harkens back to everything you see and read in a fiction novel of the Russians just putting a bullet in the back of your head. What appears that the Chinese did, if in fact this is accurate information. And you know, regardless of what you might think of the New York Times at times, I think they do very good investigative journalism when they put their gun sights on a specific topic. I know a couple of their investigative journalists quite well, specifically Adam Goldman, who won the Pulitzer for some of his investigative reporting on the New York City Police Department. But I think you're absolutely right. What I get in talking to a lot of companies is just that folks struggle with approaching this in a holistic manner. And they'll claim that they've got the latest software to defeat this kind of problem or cyber issue. But that's as far as they go. But I think a lot of these companies are literally constrained by what their legal departments will allow them to do. And I think that's somewhat of the challenge. Meaning, the only thing that at times we're brought in to bring that awareness factor to the C-suite or to the board or to those CEOs or chief legal counsels, because internally companies struggle with how to deal with this issue for a range of different reasons. The low-cost model, we're operating in China, we don't want to be accused of profiling, therefore we have to be very cautious as to the messaging, and the list goes on and on and on. And I don't see at times a lot of companies actually holistically addressing this issue. There are exceptions, but quite frankly, I think I can count them on my one hand, off the top of my head. Yes, sir.
Fred, good afternoon. My name is Roger Benvinta, and I'll follow you on Twitter based on the answer you gave. And to the point about the holistic approach, and as a software developer, having dealt with security at the the network level, the database level, the server level, and also at the application level, application security. And going back, looking at what happened recently with the Awan brothers, the Pakistani brothers, we can have all the external security. We can lock down all the servers, all the networks, all the applications, but the threat is inside. It's already in our government. It has infiltrated. Obviously, we've got, vetting and all of that has to be done, but when the president can't even, he's not allowed to implement it, his constitutional authority, we're in trouble. But do you think, I think so, do you think there's a way that there's some kind of software is put in place in addition to the vetting and security clearances and all of that, to make sure to pick a pattern of how these people, what are some of the odd things that are going on, and to have people like me who have grown up in those parts of the world, who know how these people think, to come up with a pattern recognition behavior and those kinds of things. Do you think something like that would be useful to handle these internal threats, especially for folks like those Awan brothers or any other radical Islamic threats on the inside? Thank you.
Thank you for those comments and question. I do. I'm aware of at least two big companies that have collaborated on a project along those lines, specifically geared towards that. I don't know how much traction they're getting. My internal discussions with them have centered on that, look, we might be able to get this in place in the federal space, but the chances of this getting implemented in the workforce, the global workforce, is slim to none for the range of different issues we've already discussed. So I think there's more acceptability in the federal space for that. That's just my observations and discussions with certain companies. Yes, sir, Dean.
I'm never surprised, but always troubled to hear that the GC's office can be an impediment to success. If you could give us 5 things that you wish all the GCs would start to do, what would they be?
Wow. I think that my general perceptions in dealing with GC offices or C-suites in general are that I see a lot of companies that are risk adverse. Therefore, and I'm sure as we were chatting beforehand, when you're looking at legal issues, I mean, I can remember a time when every cable being sent from one of the agencies I worked for had to be reviewed by a lawyer. Every cable on an issue, which made no sense. So I think that point one would be, I think that GCs are risk adverse and either fear of lawsuit or discrimination or what other kinds of internal problems, HR mutinies. So I would say that one, that GCs need to be more open-minded to taking into account the misery factor that the CSOs and the chief IT officers have. 2, I think that, no offense, this audience may be different, but a lot of the GCs I meet are probably technology challenged like I am, don't really know how to turn on a PowerPoint. Point 3, I'm not saying it needs to be dumbed down to the point for the GC to understand. Again, no offense, but I think that at times the technology, the emerging technology greatly exceeds that GC's understanding or ability to grasp. Point 4, companies that have been affected by bad data breaches, such as us, understand the seriousness of this And I think that most GCs don't unless you've actually had a horrific data breach. Point 5, Admiral Inman, my mentor, the former CIA and NSA official in Austin that I visit with quite regularly and has been kind enough to write blurbs for my books. He says pretty much every time I meet him that if your company if you haven't discovered a breach in your company, you just haven't looked or you don't want to look. And I think that I see and hear a lot of that as well. That unless you have that smoking gun that employee X is possibly leaking material or intellectual property has been stolen by the Chinese, that the GCs really don't want to hear it. So I could write up 5 more succinct examples than I just gave you off the top of my head, but that's the general theme I would take. And let me mention another one. I see some of the world's largest companies from a GC perspective doing very poor background checks on executive staff and employees in general, especially employees that are stationed overseas. Because the cost of doing a background check is horrendous on a regular employee working out of Brussels or Hong Kong. So nobody really wants to do it. Therefore, it's an acceptable risk we'll take. Until that employee goes bad, or, for example, what happened to Walmart in Mexico. So things have to get so bad before the GCs take action. Did I answer your question, sir?
Very well.
We have time for one more question.
Got to be at least one. Yes, sir.
So I noticed a couple of slides back regarding espionage and how a family member could be threatened. You had an entity or agency and a company could threaten a family member. So I was rather intrigued, or a business, rather intrigued to hear if when a business has threatened a family member who's on the inside versus, say, an enemy adversary. Does that happen often where you're in your business where you've had a company come to you because other companies after them?
Oh yeah, this predominantly centers on those companies that are known entities working for state organs. For example, a Chinese think tank that has a name about 25 letters long, and you have absolutely no idea who the heck they actually are, and nobody can trace them. Yes, that has happened to us, and requests to try to identify who actually are these people and what do they do.
Hey, Fred, will you tell everybody when your movie's coming out, or Showtime's putting out your movie? Because I know people are going to ask me later since I talked about it.
Peter, I wish I knew I have to say this. The screenplay writer that is doing this did Black Hawk Down. And he's a wonderful guy by the name of Ken Nolan, and big-time Hollywood screenplay writer. And he's my primary interface with the HBO crowd, though I've had several meetings with HBO. They keep a secret better than anybody, and I'm not at liberty to disclose that, but let's just say that coming to HBO soon will be which is great for me because HBO takes 2 or 3 movies a year, and they're privately funded, so they don't have to worry about cost. And from what I understand, it's a big deal to want to do an HBO movie. They get the likes of Matt Damon and Robert Duvall and people like that. So I guess they pay very well. So I'll just have to keep you posted.
Thank you.
HBO would kill me if I said more. And I want to get paid.
Follow your Twitter, right?
Sir?
I said, if you follow your Twitter, you'll find out.
There you go. If you follow my Twitter, you'll be the first to know. Thank you for having me.